welcome to this week's review of the My Hero Academia Vigilantes anime. This week we review the episode titled The Day Of, and we kick off this review as always doing these reviews by talking about the positives and the headline positives, all the big things I've been discussing over the course of this review. I think the episode is paced very well, I think it makes its tonal shift work, and the animation quality is just great. Now, I apologise if this feels more like a technical review than something that's more substantive, but let's be honest, this is not my first rodeo with this storyline. As such, certain emotional impact moments aren't quite there for me. This is not a fault of the episode, but it's just simply the fact of that it's kind of hard to be shocked by some of these things happening in this episode when I know when they're coming, and for me it's more how well or not does it actually adapt this material, how well or not, or how good or not I should say, this material is in this current form. And I will be blunt, let's just rip the band-aid off now. I still think that this is a really fantastic episode. There's certain elements of it that I wish could have hit better for me. Again, this is due in part to the fact that I do know this story ahead of time, but also I just think the execution of certain moments could have been a little bit better, but that's not to say they're bad by any stretch or means of the imagination. Now, let's be blunt here, dear listener. This is another instance where we have multiple episodes of a manga being put into a single anime episode. Now, that's understandable here, as quite honestly, I'd be shocked if they tried to drag the second half out for any longer than it is, making that second half its own episode would have felt a little bit excessive in my mind, but it is clear just going into this, having seen it now, that it's more than one or two episodes from a manga being put into this one. Maybe 2 or 3, I don't exactly remember, but it's clear given just how different the vibe of the first half feels versus the second half. Admittedly, the vibe and feel of this one isn't quite as off as in the second episode of this season, but all the same, I still think the episode works in and of itself, even though it's pretty clear that all the show planning stuff with its own episode in the manga, and I think the stuff with Knuckle Duster and B is its own 2 separate episode things being combined into this. Don't remember exactly, I know I do have the manga next to me, but I'm not going to pull it out for now, but still, you get the idea. But even still, I think the great reason why they're able to pull this off is due to the pacing, in many regards. Like, let's be blunt here, this shouldn't work. The tone and vibe between these 2 halves of this episode are very different indeed. You have a first half that's a little more laid back, a little more goofy, and a second half that seems considerably more serious and scary, but still, it is able to work because this episode itself is able to shift gear and gradually ramp up in tension and pressure quite effectively. This has helped somewhat because we know that Knuckle Duster and B are going to face off at some point either in this episode or in the next one, so the stall for that is already established ahead of time. We're able to mentally prepare ourselves for it in a way in which we wouldn't have been able to had this just come as some kind of surprise. There is a part of me that does wish we'd have got into that stuff a little bit sooner. Big confrontation between those characters I think could have come earlier in the episode, but I think that's more of a matter of taste thing more than it necessarily is a criticism of the episode, and I will admit that by doing that, there is the risk that the event stuff and all the event planning stuff would have been overwritten, for want of a better phrase, and blasted away and ignored and not appreciated had most of the thrust of the episode been focused almost exclusively on the pair of them. I know that the event stuff isn't going to be everyone's liking, because I know that there is an element within the fan base for this series that isn't keen on PopStep to begin with, and there is that element within the My Hero Academia fandom and seemingly anime fandom more broadly that seems to think that anything that isn't action or setting up for action or hard drama is just filler. And whilst this is potentially setting up for some drama with PopStep, and we might get a little bit more of an insight into her and how she's feeling at this point, more so than we got in the manga, depending on exactly how they pull all this out, I can still feel as though there's going to be an element of the fan base that is just going to take nothing whatsoever from that first half of it, as they're going to think it's a little bit too mundane and normal relative to everything else. I will admit, and this is stuff that I've said many times in the past, that I do love this event planning stuff. It brings back nostalgic memories for me when I used to do this kind of thing with my theatre company back in the day, but even beyond that, even without the bias of nostalgia, I think it does give us some neat little character character moments. Not stuff that's going to majorly change or recontextualise our point of view of these characters, but at the very least it does give us more of an insight and more of a familiarity with these characters than we would have got otherwise. And of course it also sets us up for some nice humour and gag moments, with said jokes and such coming in a way which does feel very much in keeping with the wider series. It's stuff that is very character driven, playing on our cast and their personality quirks, and how Crawler is just... he's just so socially clumsy with stuff like this, given all the stuff that he ends up saying to the leader of the dance troupe. I mean, all of this is playing within tropes that you get within stories like this, like the leader of the indie band having this fascination with the dance leader and vice versa, and it being done in a way which is very stereotypical for this genre of animation, and just with television soap opera stuff as possible. It plays hard into romance gags and tropes more generally, and I think that stuff is really fun, even though there's a part of me that wishes they played into a little bit more, like a little bit more moody romantic music playing in the background. We have the shot of them just blushing and looking at each other. You know, that stuff would be cute and fun, and yeah, look, let's be blunt, as goofy as that first half can be with the training montage, with the training montage music playing in the background, and the jokes, and the kaiju monsters that may or may not have been changed for legal reasons, fighting Captain Celebrity as his crew promoting this event coming up just throw flyers at people. He manages to do all that stuff in the first half, and yet still can make the pivot from the light-hearted stuff to the more serious action stuff in the latter half of the episode almost flawlessly. I mean, yes, whilst the second half isn't devoid of humour and isn't devoid of a slightly more bouncy, jokey humour to it, it still focused far more on the action and the drama, particularly stuff between Bee and Knuckleduster and Eraserhead versus the eel monster guy, with the grim reality that the eel monster is that slimy pervert guy from earlier in the season. And even still, in this state, he has less slime than Randy Pitchford. Anyway, I will admit, and this isn't something I will put in as a negative per se, but I do wish that the reveal that the monster guy was the eel guy from earlier on had been done a little bit better. And I think for me, the big thing that undermines it is the voice acting, as it's too clear that it was the eel guy from earlier on. I will say for clarity that I do watch this subtitled, as I generally prefer the voice acting on this series and the main series in Japanese more so than the English language voice acting. Though with Vigilantes I'm a little bit 50-50 on that at the moment, but for the time being at least I saw this subtitled. And the voice actor for the eel guy is exactly the same. Like, there's no filter or anything coming onto it. They've not pitch bent the voice. There's no echo or reverb or any weird guttural noises. It's blatantly obvious who this guy used to be. I mean, sure, it isn't too difficult to figure out, given that this strange mutant monster guy looks a lot like the eel guy from earlier on, but even still, given the way the episode itself is constructed, it does feel as though there was an attempt to have more of a mystery here than necessarily that there was. And that when we have that flashback-like moment midway through the episode, we're supposed to be sitting there and going, oh my gosh, it's him! But we don't really get that, or at least I didn't. And even without the benefit of reading this ahead of time in the manga, I would have still come to the same conclusion, because it is very obvious, even beyond the character design, it's the same person, by virtue of the voice acting. Like, I still think that all that stuff is done well for what it is, and admittedly, I do think it is stuff that will hit far better for someone who isn't as aware with the source material, and I still think it is put together well. I do like the shot where B is going into the little garage, the little renter storage thing, and we just have him just, I think in chains, sort of just lunched over, just going, pop, pop. That is creepy and nasty. Could have been creepier, could have been nastier, but I still think that it works very well for what it is. I will admit again, there's stuff about it I wish could be better, not necessarily in a negative way, though I will just say before we get into talking about the animation, as much as I love the animation in the second half of the episode, am I the only one that thought that the whole everything was a bit too dark visually? It might just be my monitor, but it was very dark and murky for much of that second half of the episode, which on the one hand makes sense because they're fighting in the middle of a blackout, but on the other hand it does take away from some of the visuals, given just how great some of those animation shots really are. The fight sequence between Bee and Knuckle Duster is great. I really think it is wonderful. As I've said in the past, something I do genuinely love about Vigilantes, and it's something that I do think is there to certain degrees within the main series, is that a problem I've had with a lot of superhero fiction over the past decade and a half is that all too often we have superheroes effectively fighting mirror versions of themselves, you know. Iron Man fights another Iron Man. Ant-Man fights another Ant-Man. They're effectively the same guy, but they've got a different costume on. And as such, the fight sequences between these two characters ultimately feel the same. That's not the case here, because both Bee and Knuckle Duster are two very different fighters. And they both have to work to compensate with whatever they're going up against. Knuckle Duster has to use this zapper thing because he ultimately wants to try and save his daughter, whereas Bee has bomb bees! Bees with bombs! And that stuff is cool. It's interesting to see how the two of them work. A very close-range fighter versus a very long-range fighter. One that is effectively trying to debuff and mutate whoever she's fighting against, whereas the other one is just more of a force of nature, and it's a matter of seeing who's ultimately going to be the one to take the other down. And I like how it's all put together. There's an active and conscious effort on behalf of Bee to try and get away from Knuckle Duster with all due haste, trying to avoid any direct combat with them, given, you know, they know at this point that Knuckle Duster isn't playing around and he's willing to get his hands dirty, so to speak, to save his daughter. And they know just how important their mission is, so they can't really sit around and dick around too much. And all of this ends up in a weird way, and it's something I've only just realised now, so forgive me if I go off a little bit off script here, but this ends up underlining the thing that the voice on the other end of the phone was calling them out on. They were calling them out about being reckless and wasting their time and getting involved with stupid stuff that's wasting time and wasting resources, and it's going to undermine their operation. And here we are with her setting up for this big, elaborate plan, and it's undermining her. Like, I know without going into a whole what-if here, but had she not bothered with the eel monster and just kept him in the renter storage and then just ran down to get them and had the pair of them, the eel monster and Knuckle Duster fighting, she could quite easily have run away, but she didn't, because she wanted to set up this big, elaborate criminal display. She wanted to put on her own show, her own performance, with people going wild and crazy, and maybe, just maybe, getting a sample of hero quirk juice or what have you, and he ends up backfiring with her in this moment. Well, of course, we'll see how all this ends up rolling out, but yeah, it does end up underlining the fact that, yeah, she's a bit too reckless for her own good, and now she's trying to fight in a way which also undermines how reckless she can be, because she's used pretty much all of her bomb bees. So she's now trying to figure out ways in getting around all of this, with probably having spent most of her arsenal to begin with. Whereas Knuckle Duster, whilst he is a force of nature, is a far more disciplined fighter. Oh, look at that! This fight sequence is reflecting the personality more so than it is representing just having an action sequence. It's reflecting the personality, mental states, and characters of the characters taking part in it, and it's not just an excuse for people to thump each other really, really hard till someone falls over. Great! Wonderful! Fantastic! Top marks all round. But anyway, with all that said and done, let us get into the negatives. And this isn't a criticism of the episode per se, but the problem I have with this episode ultimately is that it feels like a connecting tissue episode. Now, one could argue that it is, by virtue of the fact that it is still 2 or 3 episodes rolled into one, and this is a episode that ultimately ends very early into an action sequence, and given that we're about 2 or 3 episodes away from the end of the season, you know, it has the unfortunate matter of just being the start of something. It isn't going to be possibly quite as hobnailed as the next episode is going to be, because I'm not sure if we will get a resolution to this fight or not in the next episode, because, you know, we still have to end with some kind of great moment to wrap all this up, just in case there isn't a second season, though. I think at this point, yes, there's going to be one, but, you know, you get the idea. But even still, this is an episode that ultimately, in the day, is setting up for what's coming next, more so than it is its own self-contained entity. Now, that's understandable. You're always going to get this kind of feeling with any kind of end-of-season episode, or the final 2 or 3 episodes of a given season. this was a problem with this most recent series of Doctor Who, but that most recent series has a lot of its own problems anyway, without getting too distracted. But I still think, in fairness though, that this is just a simple case of that. I don't know, maybe it is a case that all the party planning stuff, all the show playing stuff should have been its own episode, so that then you can but even then, even if this was an episode almost exclusively contained with Bee and Knuckle Duster fighting, you still have the problem that it is just the opening act of a larger fight. So yeah, again, this isn't something I can really be overly negative about, because it's just the nature of the beast, it's just the nature of these stories. But I do wish there was at least one element introduced into this episode that was concluding in some way. Which I suppose it is, like, there's a brief drama as to whether or not they're going to do the show because one of the Feathers dancers hurts themselves, but I don't know. I've always had this feeling when you have episodes like this, there still needs to be something within the episode that gets a conclusion. Something that gets a bit more of a wrap-up, so at least you leave it feeling that at least something was done, but yeah, that's a different strokes thing. With all that said and done, let's get into overview and say that I think this is still a fantastic episode. Yes, there are certain elements about it that I do wish could have been done better, but I think that this is more of an almost, I wouldn't say it's theatre of the mind, but almost a adaptation of the mind. Like, as a fan of the manga, when you're reading it, or indeed any source material, whether it's a manga, a comic book, a book, or what have you, there's always this thing in the back of your head that's imagining how it's going out, how it's playing, how it could be adapted if it's a TV show, or a movie, or a stage play, or what have you. And almost always your version of it feels a little bit different, and in your own personal bias way it feels a little bit better. But still, this is still a fantastic series, and I don't want to get too far away from it, because, you know, the animation in that final part of the episode was great, particularly that shot where Knuckle just is swinging along and he's shouting down the barrel of the camera. Just how that's animated and put together just looks bloody fantastic. And just top marks, thumbs up all around. Brilliant, great, good. Well, that's said and done, however, let's get into Comment Corner. It's time for Comment Corner, and another week where I forgot to reply to the comments before. Oh, whatever. I've been very busy with stuff, ladies and gentlemen. Things are very difficult for me at the moment. But still, we continue on, and we got a comment from Big X1 who says, and this, of course, referring to last week's episode event announcement, this episode was a good start. Nervous where this one will land. Thank you for your comment. And thus far, I have to say, it's like a case of so far, so good. As I mentioned just then, the only issue that I have is stuff that is just the nature of adaptation and television adaptations, and it's just visual differences I kind of wish were a bit different, but still, so far so good. I'm confident that he might well stick this one, but we'll see where we go with it. The next comment comes from Jack O'Lantern, and I'm not going to read all of it, but they say that considering how important Soga becomes late in the series, I kind of wish we got to a scene where we see Soga and Knuckle Duster having their initial conversation, where Knuckle Duster ends up trying to recruit Soga, and where Soga explains his initial reasons for seeking Knuckle Duster out as heated by previous episodes. I know we can make the assumption based on what we know that it was probably for redemptive purposes, but I still would have liked to hear Soga's own words and thoughts on the subject during the conversation. I remember thinking the same thing when I was reading the manga. Thank you for your comment, and I can't discuss too much on Soga's character because, well, we don't want to spoil anything that is in the manga, and also because I've not read the manga in its entirety yet. But with that said, it's one of those elements in the story that I do wish this adaptation had got into. Because whilst I know that adaptations of manga in an anime format can be incredibly faithful, give or take a few moments or series of events here and there, it's one of those things, those great just question marks, I don't think has really been resolved, certainly not in this part of the story. Because it just feels like he enters into it as a recurring character for no good reason other than the fact we had a character design still waiting to go. I don't know how better to put it. Maybe this is something I'll consider for a future video, probably when I've read the entire thing, but it's just an element of the character just feels odd. That he becomes such a recurring character, at least at this part in the story, without much of an explanation as to how he became a recurring character, how he came to work with Knuckle Duster. Because I think that itself would elevate his character a little bit more and gives us something more to latch onto with them. Because at this point in the story, we haven't had much of a deep dive into his backstory, apart from how his quirk manifested and the results of people freaking out about it. But still, we'll see where we end up going with all of that. There's certain elements I do think we should be adapted better or just put into the adaptation. But hey ho, that's a whole other series of events. Well, that's done. However, let me know what everyone thought about this particular episode, whether you loved it or hated it. Let me know in the comment section down below, and you read out in a future video. Thank you all for watching, thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye!
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!